This is the second lecture in Module 5 where we're exploring XNA and how we can use it to build games. So here are the Module 5 learning objectives, and today we're going to address the second one where we're going to load and draw some sprites in our XNA game. So last time we talked about the basic concepts about how games in general and XNA games in particular work. This time we're going to build our first XNA game. And at the end of last lecture, I said I hesitate to call it a game. So you should take this in-lecture quiz to tell me why I have that hesitation. I should tell you, based on one of the options in that in-lecture quiz, that I am not a hardcore traditionalist about programming. When you program, you are allowed to drink any flavor of Mountain Dew. It doesn't have to be the original green stuff. Okay, so let's actually start up the IDE. I've already built a project and we'll get to work loading and drawing sprites. So if you look at the desktop here, you'll see that when we create a project, we get a whole bunch of stuff built, especially for XNA games. We have multiple folders. So I'm going to double click the one that says Microsoft Visual next to it. There are more words there that we can't see. Okay, so here's my project. We've talked about what happens when you just get this blue screen. Just double click. Game 1 is where we're going to do a lot of our work here. So that's what we'll double click. And we'll start off by running this and seeing that it gives us that cornflower blue screen. And we'll keep the blue, but that aspect ratio is just crazy. So let's actually make this build an 800 by 600 game. And we can do that. Remember I said some of our initialization can happen in the constructor. Let me zoom in. So we're going to change the resolution to 800 by 600 because that's an awesome, amazing resolution for games these days. The way we do it is we access. Remember, there's this graphics device manager. We didn't really talk about this before, but there's this graphics device manager that is for managing our graphics device. So we will set the graphics. So this is an object reference followed by a dot. Preferred back buffer width. So no parentheses. So object dot something with no parentheses means we're accessing a property. And we'll set the preferred back buffer width to 800. And we'll set the preferred back buffer height to 600. So there's all kinds of sort of underlying details. Just so you know what a back buffer is, basically what happens is stuff gets drawn to the back buffer first, and then it gets slammed to the graphics card to be displayed on the screen all at once. And that actually helps prevent flickering and all kinds of weird things that happen if you don't actually use a back buffer. So we'll run it with F5 and we see now, awesome, we have an 800 by 600 screen. So that's great. The next thing that we want to do is we want to actually declare some fields in this class. These are just variables for loading and drawing a couple of sprites. Let's do 3. Teddy bear drawing support. So we'll start with 1 actually, and we'll add the rest of them. How about? So texture 2D. It turns this light blue color because this is a class. Texture 2D is a class that is provided within the XNA framework in the graphics namespace. And really, it's for holding two-dimensional textures, right? Pictures. Think of it as pictures, 2D pictures. Now, it turns out that if you read any of the documentation, it talks about texels inside of these things, which for our purposes, we can think of as pixels on the screen. They're called texels because they're textures and we could wrap them around models and do all kinds of weird stuff, but we're not going to do any of those things. Okay, it's not weird stuff, it's logical stuff, just in the 3D world. So we're not going to worry about that. We'll just think of them as a two-dimensional texture or a picture. And so we'll say, let's call this bear 0. Now it turns out when it's time to draw bear 0, we're going to need to provide some additional information for the drawing, where we want it drawn, how big we want it drawn, those kinds of things. So we're going to provide, there's lots of different ways we can do this, but we're going to provide a rectangle in which bear 0 gets drawn. So we'll call this draw rectangle 0. I started at 0, by the way, because programmers start counting at 0. There are lots of really both logical and historical reasons for doing so. So you should just practice and get used to that. That's what we do. We start counting at 0. Okay, so I have declared 2 fields here that I'm going to use for loading and drawing my teddy bear. Now it turns out, though, that I actually have 2 projects over here in my solution. I have something called first XNA game, because that's what I called the project, and that holds all the code for my game. I also have this first XNA game content project, and you will be shocked to hear that that holds the content for my game. So I regularly have students try to put content up here and wonder why it's not working, and it's not working because content goes in content. Wow, awesome. Okay, so you can see here, though, that there's nothing down here. There is no content available for me to load yet. Let's go back to Windows for a minute. And I'm going to now navigate through the structure of my XNA game project. So here's first XNA game. That's the total solution, which contains 2 projects, game for the code and content for the content. And I'll double click content, and you'll see that I in fact have already copied some PNG files over here into the content folder. So this is all Windows stuff. This is not XNA stuff. This is Windows stuff. I put the content into that folder. Okay, back to the project. Now to get that content into the project, what I can do is I can right click the content project, and I'm going to say I want to add an existing item. And when I do, I'm going to pick, I'll just pick all 3 of these. I will try to pick all 3 of these. I'll pick all 3 of these and add them to my project, and now you can see that they're loaded here in my content. And I can look at the asset name, which I'm going to need soon, for each of these just by clicking it. And by default, the asset name is the file name without the file extension. In this case, PNG, because there's transparency included or opacity included. Okay, so we said that we will load all our content here. Let's say we'll load teddy bears and build draw rectangles. Now, loading, we're going to load the texture 2D into bear 0. And we do that using content with a capital C. And that's what's called a content manager. And the content manager manages content. And so we use content with a capital C. And now we want to access one of the methods in content. And we want the load method. Now this is new, these little less than, greater than signs. We won't worry about the details of it. It's actually something called a generic, which we'll address when we get to lists and so on. But the content manager can load all kinds of content. So we need to tell it between the less than and greater than what kind of content we want it to load. In this particular case, we want it to load a texture 2D. We are calling a method, even though this is a slightly different way of calling a method. So we're going to need parentheses. And you can see from this IntelliSense help that we need to provide the asset name. And so the asset name for teddy bear 0 is in fact teddy bear 0. So this should load our content just fine. Let's run it. Great. So you might wonder, why did I bother running this if it just gave me the blue screen again? Well, look what happens if I have the incorrect content name. I press F5, it tries to run, it crashes, it tells me bad things here. So running it after you've added code, even if there's, sorry, I will stop debugging now, even though there's no visible change in the program output, is a reasonable thing to do to make sure you got this right. So when I got into post-production for this lecture video, I discovered it was a massively huge 22-minute long lecture. And while my students in my actual classroom would kill for me to give such a short lecture, that's way too long for a MOOC course. So I'm going to stop this lecture here, and I've broken it into two parts. So I'll stop it here and then go watch the other lecture to see the continuation to the end.